Hi, everybody. This is Rob Windsor, and this is a recording of a session that I gave at the DevLink Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee on August 17th, 2011. The topic is SharePoint for ASP.NET developers, so it's an introduction to SharePoint development, mostly focusing on SharePoint 2010. Unfortunately, the audio for the recording isn't fantastic. There was bleed-through from the room next door, and that muddles a little bit of what I'm saying. I've tried to do the best I can to address these issues while editing, and I think most of the content is understandable. If you have any questions or comments about the material, you can contact me. My contact info is shown at the end of the presentation. All right, so let's move in and take a look at SharePoint for ASP.NET developers. So as I mentioned, I wanted to become a SharePoint developer, and I wanted to come and sort of understand what SharePoint is, and really that's what this talk is about, right? So first off, what is SharePoint, or at least what is SharePoint in terms of the developer experience? What do we really need to understand what SharePoint is? And the first thing you need to really get is that SharePoint is a platform, right? SharePoint isn't a shrink-wrap product you just install on a system and magically things happen, right? It's a platform that sits on top of ASP.NET. That platform provides business services to solve problems for organizations, right? And then what you're going to do is when people come to you and say, I have this problem, I need to do these things, then what you need to do is say, okay, well, the platform provides services that handle, this percentage of those things. So we'll use the platform to solve the part of the problem it can, and then when the platform can't solve the problem, you need a little bit of additional functionality that's not there, then you as a .NET developer, a SharePoint developer, come in and extend the services that are provided by the platform to solve the business problem, okay? So saying that implies that for you to be able to know how to solve the problems, you have to understand the pieces of functionality, the services that SharePoint provides, what the platform provides, right? And that's absolutely the case, right? And I don't want to scare anybody out of the room like within the first 2 slides of the deck, but really, SharePoint is a gigantic piece of software, right? Even if you're just talking about SharePoint Foundation, which is just the core part of it, it's still very, very big, right? So to understand SharePoint at the level you're going to need to be able to solve business problems is like saying you need to understand the breadth of the .NET framework, right? It's at that order of magnitude. It's a big, big learning curve that you have to go through and understand to be able to be an effective SharePoint developer, right? It's very, very counterintuitive, but in the SharePoint world, when somebody comes to you and says, I need to be able to do these things in the business, the last thing you should think about is opening up Visual Studio, right? That should be your last resort. Your first resort should be, let's go and take a look what SharePoint can do. Let's see how we can build a solution using the facilities that SharePoint provides. And it's only when you come to a point where you can't solve the problem using SharePoint as a platform that you open up Visual Studio and start writing code, okay? So it's a very, very big mind shift to get into and understand how to be an effective SharePoint developer and make use of the facilities that people have, right? Most organizations are spending a whole lot of money to buy SharePoint Server to put on their systems, right? It's up to us to make sure that they get value for that money and utilize the software that they've purchased and build solutions on top of it, okay? So, when you first started, I was trying to look for a, drinking out of the fire hose picture, but that's the closest I could get. But it is that thing, right? When you first start out, there's just so many things that are coming at you that you really need to understand to be effective, that you kind of feel, like this. So let's look at the platform and the architecture. For SharePoint 2007, your options for the operating system are Windows Server 2003 or Windows Server 2008, okay? SharePoint 2007 does not run on client operating systems. Bamboo Solutions had a piece of software they put out to kind of hack it so you could run SharePoint 2007 on Vista, but it's not supported, so your mileage may vary there. But officially, it only runs on the server OSs. Now, these can be 32-bit or 64-bit, okay? SharePoint 2010, in production, only runs on Windows Server 2008 64-bit, okay? But Microsoft added for SharePoint 2010 the ability for development purposes only to run SharePoint on Windows 7 or Windows Vista. I believe it's Service Pack 1 or later. Okay? So if you're doing your development, you don't have to have a server OS to be able to develop for SharePoint with SharePoint 2010. The 64-bit requirement still is there, right? So when you're developing for SharePoint or when you're using SharePoint 2010, you have to be running a 64-bit OS. Okay? For both 2007 and 2010, you need SQL Server. SharePoint stores configuration and content information inside of SQL Server. For development purposes and for very, very small production deployments, you can use something like SQL Server Express, right up to the full enterprise versions of SQL Server. With SharePoint 2010, the 64-bit requirement also exists on your SQL Server, right? So it has to be running on 64-bit OS as well. Okay? So sitting on top of the OS is the .NET Framework, okay? For SharePoint 2007, that can be the .NET Framework 3 or 3.5. For SharePoint 2010, it's the .NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1. Right? Now, a lot of people think that SharePoint 2010 runs on ASP.NET 4 or .NET Framework 4 because the .NET Framework 4 and SharePoint 2010 came out almost simultaneously. It's actually not the case, the reason being that Microsoft needed a stable version of the framework upon which to develop SharePoint 2010, so they stuck with 3.5. Okay? And then for both SharePoint 2007 and 2010, there's basically two core flavors of SharePoint, or two core editions, right? There's the Service Edition, and for 2007, it's called Windows SharePoint Services 3. For SharePoint 2010, it's effectively Windows SharePoint Services 4, but Microsoft just renamed it to Microsoft SharePoint Foundation, right? It's the core of SharePoint, right? This is free. The license for your OS covers the license for this. So you can install the service version of SharePoint on top of your client OS or your server OS and use it without any additional cost. Okay? A lot of the things that people associate with SharePoint, information collaboration, document management, the ability to have end users manage the SharePoint environment, is in Foundation. Right? Also, the core developer APIs that we're going to take a look at, that's in Foundation as well. Right? So when you're first starting out with SharePoint, you absolutely can use Foundation to get up and going, and even when you're doing production development, quite often you can just get away with using SharePoint Foundation. Okay? Now, on top of the entire stack is SharePoint Server. So for 2007, that's Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007. For SharePoint 2010, it's Microsoft SharePoint Server 2010. This is a retail product that sits on top of everything else that provides additional functionality that mid to large size organizations require. Right? So the ability to do things like enterprise search, where I can search more than just SharePoint content. I can search web content, I can search public folders, I can search just plain internet sites, and so on. The ability to do public-facing websites and have distributed authoring of content across my organization and schedule publishing and do stuff like that. Right? SharePoint Server is a fairly expensive piece of software, but most organizations find that the value they get from it is worth the expense. Okay? So this is the general architecture of both SharePoint 2007 and SharePoint 2010. By the way, during the talk, if you have any questions, just yell them out, put up your hand. I'll be happy to answer them. All right, so if I want to do development for SharePoint, what do I need? The standard practice people use is that developers have their own isolated SharePoint farm, is what it's called, that they develop against. So they have their own copy of SharePoint, right? It has its own databases and so on. And they do all of their development in this isolated environment that's just, for them only. And then they take their work and they promote it up to like a developer integration area, up to QA, up to staging, up to production, and so on, using a packaging mechanism, which we'll talk about towards the end of the talk. Okay, but each individual developer has their own isolated environment. This is important for a couple different reasons. We're going to take a look at the tooling that's out there for Visual Studio that allows you to do SharePoint development in a productive manner. All of the tooling requires that you have SharePoint deployed locally to work, right? I shouldn't say requires. Some of the tooling absolutely requires it. Some of the tooling, it will only really work if that's the case, right? If you have SharePoint deployed locally on your developer box. You can do workarounds, but the whole idea of those tools being there to increase your developer productivity are lost if you don't have that situation. Another thing which we'll see a little bit later on in the talk is that every time you deploy your work, the IIS web application in which you're working will be reset, right? So if you try to do team development across the same set of SharePoint sites, person A starts their work, they deploy it, they start testing, and then person B deploys, resets the web application, that other person's going to start again, right? So it's really easy to have a situation where people are stepping on each other's toes if you attempt to do a team development within the same web application, right? So for these reasons, again, virtually everybody who can works in a situation where they have their own isolated developer environment, their own copy of SharePoint, which then they work, and then they promote up their work through the packaging mechanism, which I'm going to talk about later on. Okay? It's also extremely common for people to develop in a virtual environment as opposed to on their physical hardware, right? There's lots of software out there that supports that. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Okay? So your developer box is going to have some version of SharePoint. Windows SharePoint Services, Microsoft SharePoint Foundation, if you just have the service part, or you can have the server part as well, right? Obviously, there's going to be potential licensing issues if you ever want to deploy server. Right? If you have an MSDN license, that's fine if each individual developer has that. But again, that's just something you have to be aware of. They're going to have Visual Studio, right? So depending on which version of SharePoint you're developing against, you can use different versions of Visual Studio. You're going to have a tool called SharePoint Designer. This is a free download. There's a 2007 version and a 2010 version. SharePoint Designer is mostly a end user or a power user tool for customizing SharePoint. It's really great in a lot of areas for prototyping with developers, and there's a couple areas, particularly when you start looking at the 2010 version, where you're going to do your work in SharePoint Designer, even as a Visual Studio developer. Okay? This is another tool that you need to learn as part of the learning process. Right? As I mentioned before, you have to have SQL Server. If you're in a dev environment, that's almost always SQL Server Express, right? And then you're probably going to want to have Office as well to be able to test things like workflows and business processes and that kind of stuff. Okay? If you go the virtualization route, you have a few different options. If you're doing SharePoint 2007, you can use Microsoft Virtual PC. This is a free download. It is restricted to only working with 32-bit client operating systems, right? So it can only work with SharePoint 2007. If you're going with some other virtualization options which will work with both 2007 or 2010, you have Microsoft Hyper-V, right? This would mean that your development box is running Windows Server 2008. Hyper-V doesn't run on other operating systems. So if you're doing your dev on a server box, then you can use Hyper-V. You can also use VMware or Oracle VirtualBox. This is what, again, this is for 2007 or 2010, and it works fine on client operating systems. Okay? Another thing that's becoming more and more popular is to virtualize but use cloud hosting, right? So like Rackspace, CloudShare, these kinds of services, right? Where they're hosting SharePoint for you up in the cloud, and then you use that as your virtualized environment, right? And they're becoming more and more affordable as well. If you virtualize locally, some recommended RAM allocations, 2 gigs for the service versions of SharePoint, whether it's 2007 or 2010, is plenty. When you get into the server versions, you can kind of get away with 2 gig of RAM, but it's going to be slow, depending on what services you enable. Like, for example, if you try to have a server that also has Exchange on it and so on, it's going to be really slow. So you're getting into 4 to 6, right? As a recommended environment, but again, you can get away with a little bit lower. It's just going to the performance is going to be fairly slow. Okay, so these are the environments you're going to have as a SharePoint developer. Now, for 2010, there's actually a really nice set of instructions out there that go through exactly how to set up your development environment. If you just search on the title of this document, there's a really nice walkthrough here. It's got all the steps you need to do to go and get SharePoint 2010 and install it on any one of the operating systems I mentioned that are there available for you to use. Okay? I haven't used it, but after I started installing this and so got everything set up for myself, Microsoft came out with these PowerShell scripts called the Easy Setup scripts, where you just download SharePoint and you just run these PowerShell scripts and it installs everything. Okay? I haven't used it personally, so I can't say what my experience has been like, but I don't have any, it's been out long enough now that they would have worked out any kinks with that, where you can even make it easier and just automate the whole process. Okay, so again, just do a search on the title of that document to be able to find the setup instructions. Really not that difficult at all to get through and get your development environment set up. Just one thing I found, and again, it's been a while since I've done this, but when I did it, it was important to install Visual Studio after you install SharePoint, not before. All right, so getting to environments, I'm using Oracle VirtualBox. I don't know if you've heard of this piece of software. It's an open source piece of software. It was owned by Sun and then Oracle, and it took me a long time to really get up the nerve to install something by Sun or Oracle, but I did it. And I've actually really enjoyed this piece of software. I find it great. So I'm running a virtualized environment for SharePoint 2010. This is Windows 7, SharePoint Foundation 2010, Visual Studio 2010, Office 2007, SQL Server Express. Okay? I'm also running a SharePoint 2007 virtualized environment. Right? This is Windows Server 2008, Windows SharePoint Service. Actually, this is Microsoft SharePoint Server 2007, Visual Studio 2008, and SQL Server Express. Okay? So I have both of these environments running at the same time. If you are somebody who works with different SharePoint environments, the virtualized way to go, the virtualization is the way to go, right? So I can have environments set up for the different talks I give. I can have environments set up for the different clients I work with, right? And they all emulate as close as possible or set up in the way that I need for that particular scenario. What about tooling? So the story for SharePoint 2007 is that Visual Studio natively has virtually no tooling for SharePoint development. Okay, there are 2 item templates in 2008 and 2010 having to do with building workflows. That's it. Okay, so you actually can do SharePoint development without any tooling in Visual Studio, without any additional tooling beyond what Visual Studio provides natively, but it's very, very unproductive. You have to create folder structures within your Visual Studio project. You have to manually create markup files and code behind files and link them up. You have to create a whole bunch of XML documents to set up your what are called your manifests. You have to create a whole bunch of batch files to deploy stuff during production. It's like really, really unproductive. So because of this, the community came out with different tools. So Microsoft has a tool called the Visual Studio Extensions for Windows SharePoint Services. And then Codeplex, there's 2 projects, one called WSP Builder and one called STS Dev. So these are add-ins to Visual Studio, and each support different versions of Visual Studio that allow you to somewhat productively build SharePoint applications. They're not nearly as robust as the tooling that's built natively into Visual Studio 2010, which I'm going to demonstrate in just a moment, but they're very close. Okay? My personal favorite is WSP Builder for a few different reasons. One is it supports 2005, 2008, and 2010 Visual Studio, and you can do SharePoint 2007 or 2010 development with WSP Builder, right? So if you plan on investing, like if you're starting with it from scratch and you're picking a tool for 2007 development, I would suggest you go with WSP Builder. Okay. Whoops. Now, Microsoft recognized when they were building Visual or SharePoint 2010 that the lack of tooling native to Visual Studio was problematic, right? The SharePoint developer community in the 2007 world was split. Like some people used STS Dev, some people used WSP Builder, some people used their own custom homegrown solutions. There was no sort of, solidarity in terms of the tooling, right? So Microsoft spent a lot of time and effort into building tooling that they added into Visual Studio 2010. And that's what we're going to see in the first demo. Okay, so we'll see some project item templates, we'll see some visual designers and explorers, and we'll see that SharePoint has the ability, or in Visual Studio has the ability to do F5 deployment and debugging for SharePoint projects. Just one thing that's really important to understand here, The tooling built into to Visual Studio 2010 is for doing SharePoint 2010 development only. The tooling I'm going to show you will not work for building SharePoint 2007 projects. Okay? Yes. So there are migration utilities for if you have a visual using the Visual Studio extensions for Windows SharePoint Services or WSP Builder. There are utilities by different people to migrate those projects from 2007 to 2010. There's not really anything to go the other way. Okay? For the most part, the code you're going to write and the XML documents that get built for you are compatible. So it's not really that difficult to migrate stuff. You might have to do it on a file-by-file basis as opposed to entire projects at a time, but it's not super painful. All right, so just a couple of things before we get to our first demo. Some terms. All right, so the first thing you need to know about is this thing called a farm. Sorry, I have to hold my mouse because it's going to try to drop here. So if you install SharePoint, you have a farm. Whether it's a single machine, like the two virtual environments I just showed you, one single machine, right? So even though they're a single machine, still called the farm. Right, and then inside of the farm, you have one or more web applications. So that's this level up here where the number 6 is, right? Basically, a web application is just an extended IIS website. So when you create a web application in SharePoint using a utility called the Central Administration Utility or using like PowerShell, an IIS website will get created, and then the web config will be modified to extend it so it turns into a SharePoint web application. Okay? So there's a mapping there. This is all the world of the administrator, right? So then over here on the right-hand side, we see the world of the end user. So the two levels here we're really interested in is the one called the site collection, and then inside of there we have a number of sites. Okay? So in SharePoint, one of the things that SharePoint provides as a utility is the ability to empower end users and give them the ability to do things that quite often we would have to have IT come in and do. So for example, if I want to have a place where I can enter information and then have that stored in the database and have pages to view the information, edit it, add new things, and so on, right? These are called lists in SharePoint. Well, that's all natively part of SharePoint. So somebody who's an end user can go in and say, okay, I need a new list, here's the schema of the list, and SharePoint takes care of everything else for you, right? Whereas if we were doing that in just ASP.NET, you have to go and say, okay, I'm going to have to set up the database, I'm going to have to secure that database, I'm going to have to build the pages to do all kind of stuff, and so on, right? So we're empowering end users to do that. So the core area is this area called the site collection. A site collection is a section of a web application, right? So let's say, for example, we're building a corporate intranet, and we want to segregate by division, right? So we have HR over here, we have IT, we have sales, right? So what we can do is say, okay, well, the HR area is a site collection, and we're going to give somebody in the HR department administrative privilege in that area alone. Right, so then they're effectively the administrator within that subsection of our web application. But the fact that you've given them administrative privilege in the HR area has no bearing on their privilege over here in sales. Right? Also, the information that's stored over here in the HR area isn't natively visible over here in the sales area. Okay? Now, a developer can make that available, but just that's the sort of the default behaviors. Right? So site collections are a boundary for administrative privilege and a boundary for visibility of data. Okay. Site collections are a logical concept. They don't physically exist anywhere. They're just rows in a database somewhere, right? But what is a physical concept is the top-level website or the root of the site collection, right? So when you create a site collection, it creates a site which is what you address. And the address of the site collection and the address of its root website are the same. Right? So if I want to address a site collection, I just put the address of its root site. And then the people inside of that site collection can go and create child sites. So we can have this tree hierarchy, starting from the root down, of sites. Right? And in an information collaboration world, those sites contain lists of information, libraries of documents, and each of those things contain fields or columns. Okay? All right, so I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of the terms we're going to be using, right? So farm, web application, site collection, site, list, library, field. These are the core terms that make up the developer world and the end user world in SharePoint. Okay? The demo I'm going to show you is going to use the server object model. Okay? This is code that's going to run on the SharePoint server. So I'm building the code in a web part, I'm building the code in a page, I'm building an event handler that's going to run on a list when we make changes, that kind of stuff. Okay? So this is really the only option you have when you're building code that's going to run natively in the SharePoint context. Right? There's a couple options here about building remote applications. So I want to build a Windows Forms app or a WPF app or an ASP.NET app that talks remotely to SharePoint. Right? SharePoint provides a set of web services that you can call. The web services, at least in my opinion, the API isn't great. Very, very XML heavy. But whether you're doing SharePoint 2007 or 2010, they will work. If you're doing 2010, Microsoft introduced these things called the client object models. Okay, there's one for native .NET code, there's one for Silverlight applications, and there's one for JavaScript. Okay? But they basically all work the same way. The client object models are closer in terms of the API to the server object model, so the type names are very, very similar. You're calling the same kinds of methods and so on. So it's much more, I think it's much more robust than the service layer, and it's also a smaller learning curve if you're coming from the server object model. Okay, but when you first start out doing SharePoint development, you're mostly going to be learning the server object model. All right, so I'm going to do a demo. I'm going to walk you through, and then I'm going to come back and revisit pieces of the demo to talk about how it's unique to SharePoint, right? So the first part of the demo is to do two things. One is to illustrate the tools that are available for you, whether you're doing SharePoint 2007 development or 2010 development, but we're going to focus on 2010. And the second thing is to show you that the development process is very similar to the development process that you know as an ASP.NET developer, right? At least it is on the surface. So what's going to happen in the second part of this, and towards the end of the talk, is that we're going to sort of look behind the scenes and see all the things that probably weren't obvious to you when we go through this first part of the demo that are very SharePoint specific and are vitally important for you to understand. Right, and especially with the tools in Visual Studio 2010, they're mostly hidden from you if you don't know where to look. Okay? Again, if you have any questions at all while we're going through this, just yell them out. All right, so here I am in my Windows 7 environment. It has, again, SharePoint 2010 Foundation and Visual Studio 2010. This is what's called a team site, right? This is the standard collaboration site. I just created it. The only thing I've done is I went into the Northwind sample database, right? No demo is complete without showing data from Northwind. And I've imported data for 4 lists: products, orders, actually 5, I think, customers, orders, details, and so on. Okay? So I actually went and created lists within SharePoint and then took the data from Northwind and put it into SharePoint lists. Okay? So I'm not linking off to the database. These are actually, this data lives inside of SharePoint. Okay? I've done exactly the same thing over here in 2007, right? So I have a team site and I have the lists import. All right, so what I want to do is just build a little application where I can browse my lists. So I'm going to come over here and say File, New Project, and this is Visual Studio 2010. And then in 2010, in both the Visual Basic and the Visual C# nodes, we have a node called SharePoint, and inside of that we have the 2010. So you notice for SharePoint 2010, we have a set of project templates here we can use, right? If I go into 2007, you can see there's just the 2 that I mentioned that are there around workflows. Okay? So we'll go into 2010. And we want to set, it'll actually do this natively for us, but we do want to set the framework to be 3.5 because that's the version of the framework we use. And then pretty much always you're going to pick this empty SharePoint project. It's very rare you would create just the web part or just the workflow. Normally you're creating multiple things in your projects, so you almost always start out with the empty one here. Okay? And we'll give it a very intuitive name like SharePoint Project 54. Okay, we'll go ahead and click OK. And then there's this dialog box going to pop up here. Okay, we're going to ignore this for right now. but I am going to come back and talk about what was on here. The one thing that is important, actually two things that are important. One is I'm going to put in the name of the site or the address to the site I'm going to use for debugging. Okay, so when I hit F5, it's going to bring up this site to allow me to debug my work. Okay, so that is important. The second thing that's important here is if I didn't have SharePoint installed on my local developer box, at this point Visual Studio will put up a dialog saying, I'm sorry, you don't have SharePoint installed locally, I can't let you use these tools. Okay, I can't work. I need to have that there. Right, so you would be stopped at this point. Okay, whoops, I didn't want to do that. Let me just try that again. So file new project, 2010, empty SharePoint project, 55 this time. Remember that, it's important. There'll be a test. And we'll click finish. Okay, and what gets created? Well, let's take a look over here in our Solution Explorer, once this stuff goes away. And we can see that there is a project. It's basically a class library project, right? When we build, we're going to build a DLL. But it has a couple extra nodes in there. You can see there's a features node and a package node. We'll talk about what those are in the second part of the talk. Okay? And there's also a strong name key file. A lot of times when you deploy your work in SharePoint, you're deploying to the gap. So you need a strong name. Okay? So let's go ahead and right click and say add new item. And then because we're in a SharePoint project, it's going to give us a bunch of different options here. Right? And again, these are the item templates. You may hear them referred to as SPIs, SharePoint project items, right? They're just Visual Studio item templates that are specific to SharePoint. Okay? So we'll pick this one here called Visual Web Part, and we'll call this, my web part. And we'll go ahead and click Add. And some stuff happened over here in the Solution Explorer, which I'm going to skip for right now. I'm going to come back to it later on. But the important thing is that, just like when you add a page in an ASP.NET project, you're going to have, some markup, and you're going to have a code behind file, right? One thing I didn't mention earlier, which is important to understand, SharePoint is built on top of the web forms model, okay? You can't use the ASP.NET model. It's built on top of the web forms model, so you're going to have, standard stuff, server controls, master pages, all that kind of web form goodness that we all love, okay? And then over here in the design area, or the markup area, we have the markup. Like this is the standard user control, and we can go into design mode if we want to here. And I'm going to go to the toolbox, and I'm just going to open that guy up, and we'll put down a couple of controls. So we'll fire down a drop-down list, and we'll put down a grid view. Okay, and then we need the drop-down list. The drop-down list is going to show the names of the lists in the current site. So we need that too, as soon as this goes away. There we go. When I change this, I want it to post back so that we can update the grid with the data from that list. And I need the event handler for that event, and then we're good. Okay, so I'm going to just go into full screen mode here. So in the page load, what I want to do is go get a reference to the current SharePoint site that we're living in, and then bind the collection of its lists into the dropdown. Okay? So I'm going to just say here, if is postback is equal to false, then we want to get the current site. So I'm going to go create this thing here, and I'm going to say the SP context. The SP context is very similar to the HTTP context in a web application, right? It's information about the current context. And then I'm going to say .current.web. And then usually at this point somebody says, what's this web thing? And it has nothing to do with like Spider-Man or like that. What it is in the early versions of SharePoint, the first version of SharePoint, what we today call a site was called the web. And what we today call a site collection was called the site. So while the end user terminology has evolved to those terms, the developer, like the names in XML documents and the names of the types in all of the APIs stay the old ones, right? So you have to kind of have to do this mind mapping where it's like, when we think site, the type I'm going to use is a web. And then when we think site collection, the type I'm going to use is a site. It's a little bit confusing when you first start out, but it sort of becomes second nature after a while. Okay? So there's our site. And then I'm going to say here, drop down list one, dot data source, is equal to web.lists. So just get the collection of lists from the site that are there, right? And then I'm going to say here drop down list one dot data text field, right? What do I want to show in the drop down? I want to show the title of the list, and then finally drop down list one dot data bind, right? So I actually want to perform the data binding. And then down here, when I select, I want to get the web again, right? So I want to get the current site. And then I want to go get the list that the user's chosen, and then I want to show its data in the grid view, right? So I'm going to say here var list is equal to web.lists, and then it has an indexer where I can pass in the list name, so that's going to be the text in the drop-down list that the user chose. And then it has a collection, the list has a collection of items which I can bind to the grid view. So I'm going to say here, grid view one dot data source is equal to list dot items, and then this has a nice little helper method which will export the items into a data table, so you can bind it real easy. And then we'll say here grid view one dot data bind. Okay, so I'm just going to do a build, make sure I haven't made any typos. That's good. All right, and I'm just going to make one small change here, which we're going to talk a little bit about at the very end of the talk around deployment. So I'm just going to do this down here and uncheck this box and save that off. And then I'm going to click the little play button or the run button. Could hit F5, same thing. Ooh. Oh. I forgot to check one thing. Let me just do that. This has to do with those options that I said I'm going to talk about at the end. When that dialog box came up, where I said if you didn't have SharePoint installed, I made the wrong choice there. So I just had to fix that. All right, so it's going to go through this deployment process. We'll cover the deployment process in detail, again, towards the end of the talk. And then what it's going to do is it's going to start up an instance of your default browser. It might have to be Internet Explorer. And then it's going to attach the debugger to that and allow you to debug your work. Okay? So just about finished here. You can see it is a fairly lengthy process to deploy. And we'll see why that is in a bit. So that should be finishing up just about now. Yeah. Oh, the build succeeded. Yeah, now the deploy succeeded. So now it's starting up IE, and it's going to navigate to my site and attach the debugger. So when you do run with debugging on, it can take a little bit, especially the first time you run. So normally what I do is just have my site open, and I only deploy my work. I don't actually go into the debug session. So everything is exactly the same except for I can't step through code. So if I don't care about stepping through code, the actual just manual deploy part is a little bit faster. Okay, so I have a site. I created what's called the web part, so I need a page to go test my web part. So let's go create that real quick. So I'll go in here where I can create a page, which is there, and I want to create a web part page. Spin the mouse here. There we go. I'll call this guy test. And we'll create a web part zone and click create. And then this is going to come up and it's going to allow me to add my web part in. So I'm going to click on that. And then it's going to bring up the web part gallery. And there's my web part there. I can add that in. And I can stop editing. And I just need to force this to post back so my page load event will run. Whoops. Okay, enter. All right, so there you can see it's picking up the different lists that are available inside of my site. And then I can go ahead and pick one of them. So let's just pick the customers list. And it's going to go off and get the customers list data. And it's going to render it into a grid view on the screen. Okay? And then I can go ahead and stop my debugging session. Right, so trying to illustrate here a little bit about the tooling that is available in Visual Studio 2010 for doing SharePoint development. A little bit about the development process. Again, you saw it's fairly similar to just standard ASP.NET development. But we're going to now come back and look and see how things are a little bit different when you work with SharePoint. Now, just so you know, you can do something similar over here in SharePoint 2007. So I have Visual Studio 2008, and I've downloaded and installed the WSP Builder utility that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So I can come in and say File, New Project, and then once you've installed WSP Builder, you will get a WSP Builder option here, again in both VB and C#. And I can go ahead and pick that and say I want to create a WSP Builder project, and click OK. And then once that's created, I can go ahead and right-click and say Add New Item, and there'll be a WSP Builder section with SharePoint-specific item templates. So I'll pick on that. I could say I want a web part feature. That's what I created earlier, and go ahead and click Add. And then go through the process. So you're going to see that it's going to create some files here, which we're going to focus on the next part of the talk. But the main thing is it's going to create a C# file here that I can go ahead and write my code in. And we can actually use the user control mechanism I showed you earlier over here in this version as well. So it's not, again, it's not as robust. It's not as sort of fully functional in terms of helping you do SharePoint development as it is in Visual Studio 2010, but there is tooling there which assists you and makes the process a little bit more productive. Right? So you are able to do the same things I showed you, or similar things I showed you over here in the Visual Studio 2008 world. Okay, so we just finished the first demo. Now let's sort of go behind the scenes and talk about some of the SharePoint specific stuff that happened that we need to know about. Okay? So the first thing we need to know about are these things called features and elements. In SharePoint, the component model of SharePoint are these things called features. Right? Features allow you to define a set of functionality as a logical unit. So let's say, for example, I want to create a list. And I want to have a page which shows data or interacts with that list. And then I want to create a link somewhere that links off to that page, right? So each of those three things, creating the list, creating the page, creating the link, are elements. They're pieces of functionality, right? And then I can group those things into a feature which becomes the logical unit, right? And those three things now become a package that I can use inside of SharePoint, right? And when we create a feature, normally we're going to do it either specific to an individual site, or we're going to do it that's specific to an entire site collection. Okay, so for example, when I create a web part, it goes into a place called the web part gallery. It allows end users to pick it when I add a web part to a page, right? Well, the web part gallery is a site collection scoped entity. So I would create a feature that would be at the site collection scope that would be applicable to web parts, right? But a list is something that lives in an individual site. So if I was creating a list, I would create a feature that's specific to an individual site, right? So there's this concept called an activation scope for features. And the two main ones that you're going to work at are the site or the site collection. Now you can create features that are scoped higher at the web application or farm level, much more uncommon, and those can only be activated by administrators. Okay? So features support this concept of activation and deactivation. Activation means I want to take that logical unit of functionality and add it to whatever context I'm working in, right? The site collection. And then deactivation generally means I want to remove that functionality. Now, in SharePoint, about half the things that you deploy when you activate a feature will automatically get removed when you deactivate. But about half the things will just sit there and remain, right? And then it'll be up to you as a developer to write code to remove those things if you want them to be gone, right? So for example, when I talked about the list and the link, right, the link would automatically get removed when you deactivate the feature, but the list would remain. If you want it to get removed, you have to write code to go in and delete it. Right? But the important thing to understand here is that end users can go in and they can activate the features that you create and they can deactivate them. Okay? So if we come back to our SharePoint site here, now I didn't name our feature very well. but the name Visual Studio gave it automatically was the project name space the feature name. So SharePoint Project 55, Feature 1. Okay? And you can see it's scoped at the site collection, right? Again, when we see stuff in the developer world, site means site collection. So if I go back into my SharePoint site and go to the settings for my site, you can see that there are two sections here. One is the site actions, and the top link there is to manage the features that are scoped to an individual site. And then at the bottom we have site collection administration, and the second link down are features that are scoped to the site collection. So I can go in and click on here, and we can see SharePoint Project 55, Feature 1, that has been activated. So the blue active means that this has been activated within the context. Okay? But you can see there's a couple other features, these custom site collection help and open documents and client application by default that haven't been activated. And if I wanted that functionality, I could just click on those buttons to bring it in. Right? So end users have the capability of doing this activation and deactivation with the work that you're creating. So how do I define these things? Well, I do it through XML documents. Okay? So I mentioned before, if you're just using vanilla Visual Studio with no tooling, like you have to handcraft these documents, right? Visual Studio for 2010 will do it for you. WSP Builder will do it for you, and so on. So here's the feature manifest, right? And this is going to have a collection of elements inside of it, which are the grouping of the functionality, right? So again, the elements define the functionality, the feature defines the group. And then over here we see an element manifest. In this particular one, we're defining a link off to the Microsoft website. Okay. Just a couple of things to note within these documents. Right, in this one I have a thing called a group ID. Right, so the group ID is site actions. I have a location, which is some string here, and then I have a sequence number and so on. These documents in SharePoint are full of these sort of like magic numbers, magic strings, right? So site actions is a string that has meaning, right? So the combination of the group ID and the location, the combination of those two string values indicate where that link is going to show inside of SharePoint, right? And you have to be able to know, oh, okay, well, if it's this combination here is where it's going, and if I want it to go somewhere else, what do I need to change those values to? Okay. It's sort of really error prone because you just make a mistake. Even sometimes it's just a capitalization mistake. Things won't work correctly, and when you're working with the XML documents, it can be very tricky. Another thing I should mention, I think it's actually on the previous slide. Yeah. First off, let's take a look at the schema, right? So it's HTTP schemas microsoft.com/SharePoint. So these are just XML documents, but XML documents that conform to that schema are generally referred to as CAML documents. CAML standing for Collaborative Application Markup Language. This is a schema that's used throughout SharePoint, which you can use to define things like manifests, which we're going to see. You can also use it to define data. So I want to pre-populate a list with data. I can do that in CAML. I can query data using CAML. So it's XML all over the place that you're working with. Okay. All right, so we didn't create any of these things, but they were part of our project. So let's go back into Visual Studio here and take a look. So the first thing I created was the web part, right? So if you take a look at the Solution Explorer over here, we can see that there was a node that got created to represent that item, and then inside of a bunch of documents which represent the documents associated with that item. Right? So the key one here we're looking at is the element manifest, which is elements XML. Right? So this elements XML defines that I'm going to take this file, which describes the web part. It's got a .webpart extension. Right? So it says what assembly does the web part live in. It defines some properties of it. Actually, let's take a look at it quickly. Right? So this says that I live in this assembly. So here's the type that implements the web part. And then this token here will get replaced with the fully qualified assembly name. And that the title of this is my web part, and I can change this. This is what shows up in the web part gallery, right? When a user goes to select your web part. And then here's the tooltip that's associated with this guy. Right, so this needs to go into the web part gallery in SharePoint. Right, if I go over to my site actions, site settings, and then go to galleries here, you can see there's a web part gallery, the third link down. Right, that's going to go in there. So Visual Studio has this element called a module, which provisions the web part into the web part gallery. Right, so if we take a look here, again we have some, like, how do you know it's the web part gallery? It's these two values right there that tell you. Right, the fact that the list ID is 113 and the URL is _catalog/WP. These are just things you have to know. Okay. If I just open up here and take a look at the IntelliSense, you can see there's lots of different kinds of things you can create. A content type is a very common one. A control, like this is a user control. A custom action is a link, which can be either be like a link in a page, or it can be like an addition to the ribbon in your site. A field is a column within a list. There's a whole bunch of things you can create here, right? So while Visual Studio is helping you by creating some of these things for you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to understand how these documents work. And in the worst case scenario, you'd have to be able to create these things by hand, right? So you have to be able to go and figure out, oh, what do I need to put in the listing there? What should the URL be? Do I have to have both of those in all situations, and so on, right? So don't rely on Visual Studio as a crutch and just take whatever documents it has and just, okay, fine, it's going to create them, it figures it out, I'm cool. Because what's going to happen is sometime you're going to deploy your work and it's not going to work correctly, right? And you won't, if you don't understand what's in all of these XML documents I'm showing you, you won't be able to figure out why it's not working correctly, okay? So I talked about how there's a fairly extensive learning curve for you as a SharePoint developer to understand what SharePoint provides as a platform, so you can actually be an effective SharePoint developer. Again, you have another thing here where Visual Studio is going to assist you. It's a productivity tool, but you're going to have to go in and invest time to understand how these documents work, why they're there, and what you need to change if things go wrong, or if you need to use something that maybe Visual Studio doesn't provide out of the box. Right? It is a learning curve. I mean, trying to figure out what these magic numbers are and strings are, and where to find that on the internet, and what's a reliable resource, and so on, is difficult. I'm not going to lie to you, right? But you have to do it because things are going to go wrong, trust me, and the error message you're going to get are going to be like, something just went wrong. And, oh, okay, yeah, I can figure that out myself. I'm not seeing what I wanted to see, right? You're not going to get a whole lot of help in a lot of the cases, particularly when you're working with the XML. Right? With the code, at least you can step through it. But when you're working with the XML, it's like you get very, very cryptic messages. Sometimes even misleading messages. So I can't stress highly enough how important it is for you to go and invest time and understand how element manifests work, at least for the common things you're going to create on a day-to-day basis, right? How feature manifests work, why they're there, and what each piece does. Okay, so that's the feature and element manifests. A couple other things we need to know about. Our solution packages, okay? So I talked about how you work in an isolated developer environment, right? And that when you finish, you're going to take your work and you're going to promote it up to a developer staging environment and then QA and so on, right? And the way you do that is through a solution package. A solution package is a tab file. Think of it as a zip file. It's a compressed file that contains other files, okay? We give it the extension WSP, solution package. And it contains the files that need to get deployed to our SharePoint servers. It contains one additional file, which is what's called the solution manifest, which contains deployment instructions for the server. So when you deploy in SharePoint, what you do is you give your administrator a solution package, and they do a two-step process. The first thing they do is they take that package and they deploy it into the SharePoint configuration database. We call it the solution store, but it's really just a database, okay? And then they go either through PowerShell or the STS admin command line utility or the central administration utility and schedule a job to say to all of the servers in our farm, go get that package, open it up, take a look at the solution manifest, and take the files and put them into the right place based on the instructions in the solution manifest. Okay? So that way, if we have 10 servers in our farm, the administrator goes through one process, and then SharePoint takes care of the rest and making sure that those farms all deploy out the files and everything stays in sync. Okay? So we need to be able to create this package. Visual Studio creates the package for us. So that makes our part easy, but again, we need to sort of understand what's going on there. So as I mentioned, inside of the package is this thing called the manifest. All right, so let's take a look at our project. If I go to, let's see, dev projects, and this was SharePoint 55, and we go down to the bin debug folder, and then it's in debug because I did a debug build. If I did a release build, it would be in the release folder, right? But we can see here, there's our WSP file, there's our solution package. And if I go ahead and just copy and paste it, and then just rename the extension to .cab. Whoops, I think I put a question or a comment in there. Let's try that one more time. .cab. And then just go ahead and double click on it. We can see there are the documents, right? So there's the element manifest for our web part. There is the feature XML document, which I just talked about. There's our .web part file that's going to go in the web part gallery. There was a user control. That's where we did all our design and code behind. And then there's the assembly. And then finally, there's the manifest XML. That's the solution manifest with the deployment instructions. Okay? So if we go back to our project, I showed you the element manifest. When I created the web part, a feature got created. Right, and we can see this feature designer here, but behind here is the XML manifest that gets created, right? And then also we have this package node, which has our solution in it, and it has a solution designer which says what features are part of your package, but behind that is the XML manifest. So when you go into the feature designer or the package designer and manipulate it, all you're doing is just basically manipulating this XML document behind the scenes. Okay, so what does this tell us? It says I have a DLL here called SharePoint Project 55.dll, and I want to deploy it to the gap. In SharePoint, when you create an assembly that's going to be used by things like web parts, you need to add a safe control entry into the web config file for it to work properly. That next instruction below there, the child instruction, says to add that in there for me. It also says I have a user control. And there's a place in the SharePoint system folders where user controls go. It's the control templates folder. So I want to deploy that out there. And then also at the bottom here, I have a feature manifest, which points to my feature file. Right? So it's this document that is going to instruct SharePoint how to go ahead and deploy it, right? So there's sometimes you need to modify this thing, right? Like let's say, for example, you're going through this process of upgrading a feature. So I've deployed a feature, and I want to go from version 1 to version 2. You have to make manual edits to that file for that to work properly, and so on. So again, just stressing the importance that you understand how these things work and how to be able to manipulate them outside of just using the tooling provided by Visual Studio. One other tool I wanted to show you in here that's quite useful that Visual Studio 2010 provides is the ability to explore your SharePoint sites, your local SharePoint sites. So if you go into the Server Explorer, you can open that up, and then you can take a look at your local SharePoint sites, and you can see what's inside of there. So I can just open this guy up here. That's a site collection. That site collection has one site called Demo. I can go in and see, what lists are in there, what's the schema of the list, what columns are made up. On any one of these things, I can go click on it and take a look in the Properties window and see the properties of it, and so on. Okay? And there's certain places in SharePoint where you prototype out your work using the web interface, and then you take the XML document that gets generated and stored into SharePoint, and you bring that into your Visual Studio project. And you can do that by using these tools, right? SharePoint 2007, there's a free download you can get called SharePoint Manager, which provides similar functionality. There's a 2010 version as well that provides a little bit extra functionality than it's there. It's available in Visual Studio. Okay. All right, so one other thing I want to talk about before we finish up here. What we did is called a farm deployment. Okay. So when I deployed, the files that got created, and I showed you in the cab file that were there, they got pushed out into this place called the SharePoint system folders, right? So the farm deployment is a traditional deployment, and in SharePoint, if I go into my SharePoint site here and then go to this shortcut, there's a place under Program Files, Common Files, Microsoft Shared Web Server Extensions. If you're doing SharePoint 2010, that version number is 14. If you're doing 2007, it's 12. Okay, so every single server in SharePoint has the same set of folders, and you want to keep them in sync, right? The packaging mechanism does that. So these are a set of common folders where files get pushed out, right? So if we go into this one called Template Features, and then scroll down, we should see in here, there is our feature, SharePoint 55, Feature 1. And inside of there are the documents that got pushed out. There's our feature XML, and then here's the files associated with our web part. Okay? The reason why it's called a farm solution is because when you deploy to the SharePoint system folders, the files are visible across your farm. Right? Each IIS website associated with the SharePoint web application has virtual directories that point up to the SharePoint system folders. Right? So when you deploy to these folders, your files again are visible across the entire farm. Right? Also, deployment to those folders require administrative privilege. And in certain situations, for example, if you're using Office 365 web hosted, you can't deploy to the system folders at all. You're not allowed to. So Microsoft came out with this concept called the sandbox solution. This is new to SharePoint 2010. Okay? A sandbox solution allows you to take the files, and instead of deploying them to the system folders, you're going to deploy them into the content database. Okay? Into this, basically, you do the deployment through the solution gallery. So what I can do is I can go into, and this is not necessarily administrator. This is just somebody who's owns a site collection, can go into the settings and go to galleries, and the bottom gallery there is called the solution gallery. So they can go ahead and click on that, and then they can go and upload a solution package. So they can click on, solutions here, and they can say upload solution, and then they can go find a WSP and upload it into the solution gallery. Okay? So then you have a solution that goes into the content database, and its visibility is just the site collection. Right? So my web part would only be usable if I only uploaded this one site collection in here. Other ones wouldn't be able to see it or use it. Okay? Now, there are some restrictions. You can't use the full developer API when you're working with sandbox solutions. You can't deploy anything to the SharePoint system folder. So my control template that wanted to go up in the system folders, that wouldn't work. The sandbox solution mechanism wouldn't allow it. Okay? Excuse me. Also, sandbox solutions are monitored for how many resources they use. Now, resources is sort of a nebulous term, but basically it means things that could negatively impact the performance or the stability of your SharePoint site. Right? So for example, if an unhandled exception occurs, that costs X number of resource points. Each sandbox solution can only use so many resource points before it's disabled. And all of the sandbox solutions within a site collection also have a limit on how many resource points they can use before they're disabled. And then after a certain number of time, then the resource points get reallocated and they can start up being used again. Right? And these numbers are all configurable by your administrator. Okay? So the sandbox is a much safer way to deploy work. Right? If any untrusted work, right, its ability to harm your SharePoint system in any way is drastically reduced. It also changes the visibility of the files you're deploying. In addition, the code that runs in a separate process than the code that's deployed to the farm. Right? So there's a separate user code process specifically for sandbox solutions. So if they did something drastic that shut down, the SharePoint site would continue running. Just the sandbox solutions themselves wouldn't work anymore. Okay? So this is another option that you have in terms of deployment in SharePoint 2010. Again, this is a 2010 feature only. All right, so the last thing we want to talk about here is automated deployment. So let's just go and deploy my work one more time. I mentioned that I can just manually deploy, and the way I can do that is just right-click on my project here, and then choose Deploy. Right, and this is everything that you would do if you hit F5, except for start up the debugging process, right? So I'm going to let the deploy go through, and then we'll take a look and see exactly what happened there. Okay. So the first thing it's going to do is try to run any pre-deployment scripts. These are custom scripts you can write. We don't have any, so it doesn't do anything. And then, as I mentioned, when you have a farm solution, when it gets loaded into IIS, the DLL gets locked and you can't change it, right? So what you have to do to free up the DLL so it can replace it is recycle the application pool, right? So that happens. Then, if you have previously deployed your solution, the features inside of it will get deactivated. Now, I just want to emphasize one thing because people quite often confuse this with production deployment. This is developer deployment, right? This is Visual Studio helping you out. So, for example, when I retract a solution in a production environment, the features aren't automatically deactivated, right? This is happening in the developer environment because Visual Studio is making this happen. So again, we're talking about automated deployment in the developer environment here. I want to be very, very specific about that. So the features get deactivated, your old work gets removed, and then it will deploy out your new work, right? So here it's adding in my new solution. And it said it found a deployment conflict. So again, this is Visual Studio. This is not a production thing. This is what you get at developer time. And what it's telling me is there's a web part already deployed with the same name as my web part. So it's going to delete it. Now, some conflicts, it'll just note them in the deployment and it will do the stuff automatically. But other ones, it will say, it'll actually stop the deployment process and warn you and tell you and ask you what you want to do. So for example, if I create a custom list, and a list with that name already exists, when I go to deploy it, Visual Studio is going to say, I'm going to delete this list. Are you sure you want to do that? And it'll let you choose to say yes or no. Right? So depending on the severity of the conflict, it will decide how to behave. But then our work gets added in, and all the features that are part of our SharePoint solution get activated. Again, this is something that doesn't happen normally in production deployment, but it does happen in the developer deployment because it's assumed that any work that you included, you want to test, right? So they automatically activate your features, and then if you have a custom post-deployment commit, it's there. Now, everything I've shown you so far is all extensible, right? So you can use the MEF, the Microsoft Extensibility Framework, to be able to extend all the stuff, right? So for example, for the deployment, you can go in and configure all the stuff down here in the deployment configuration. Right? You have the ability to create your own deployment configurations where you say what steps run on deployment, what steps run when you retract. If you want to extend these tools, you can add in new items into here. You can replace this designer, right? You can add in, there's tons of stuff you can add in, right? Lots of people have already done that, right? If you go to the extension manager, one very popular utility for SharePoint development is called CKS Dev. CKS standing for the Community Kit for SharePoint. Oh, I think I need to go to the online gallery to search for that, sorry. Let me try that one more time. CKS Dev. So I can just go ahead and download that and add it into Visual Studio, and then I'll get additional item templates, I'll get additional deployment options, quite a few extra and valuable tools that can get added into Visual Studio. And as time goes on, I think more and more people will build customizations that make the whole development process in Visual Studio even more robust than it is that we've seen today. Okay, so that's just another thing to think about and consider. All right, so we only have a few moments left, so I will come to the last slide here. My email address is here, my Twitter handle, my blog address again. Sometime today or tomorrow, I'll make sure that I put the slides and the demos up, and I'll tweet that and put it on my blog at some point. Again, any other SharePoint sessions this week, I'll be here. So if you have any questions, come on up, or just you can contact me via my email or Twitter. I'm happy to hang around and answer any questions you have to finish up, but So until like the 2 sessions from now when I'll be back, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.